Well, if you told me at a younger age that I would say these words, I would be shocked. Greetings, my name is Nina, welcome back to my channel. I know that the title of this video sounds kinda provocative. It is kind of weird for me to say this, but yeah. I don't wanna read fantasy anymore. What does this mean? Am I going to donate all the books and stop reading fantasy altogether? The answer is no. Of course I still love fantasy books, I'm still going to read them, buy them, you name it. Then why is there a video with such title? Well, allow me to elaborate. So my shelves are full of fantasy books. One of the best things about fantasy is how versatile it really is, just like metal. By the way, I have a video about the connection between fantasy and metal, feel free to check it out. Fantasy is epic, dark, whimsical, and whatnot. This genre is solid to this day. Then why do I say that I do not want to read it anymore? What went down? Well, there are a few reasons behind this. So let's explore them. Well, the first reason that comes to my mind is that there are too many books. Well, that's bold coming from someone who has shelves full of fantasy books and also from someone who writes fantasy books, but hear me out. Back in 2013, well, I speak from personal experience, I did not have an access to many books. The only fantasy I read in 2013 was Lord of the Rings, and then a few months later, in 2014, I became obsessed with A Song of Ice and Fire / Game of Thrones. By the way, I have a video about A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones, feel free to check it out. Then my journey to fantasy continued. In 2016 I started reading The Dark Tower, in 2017 I started reading The First Law, and in 2018 I started reading The Witcher. I want to point out that I did not get into all of these series at once. I got into them one by one. After all, my access to books at the time was limited. I didn't know other fantasy series existed at the time. Sure, there were other factors preventing me from reading fantasy, but let's focus on the fact that The Dark Tower, The Witcher, The First Law, and The Song of Ice and Fire were the only fantasy series that I knew and was able to get. At least until 2020. Maybe I've heard some titles before 2020, but these series were the only series I knew about and was able to get and read. In short, I did not encounter much fantasy, at least the series back in the day. By the way, there is more to say about series and I'm going to talk about them later. Then 2020 came and things changed. I discovered more series, but some things changed. Well, first of all, I discovered the bookish segment on YouTube. I started watching a lot of videos about books there. And I also started reading grandiose series around the same time. Well, for example, the Kingkiller Chronicle, the Stormlight Archive, and the Wheel of Time. All at once. I'm not gonna talk about how I got into these books because there's something else I want to uncover in this video. Something I think I haven't addressed before, well, mostly because I didn't notice it previously. In short, the more videos I watched by various different booktubers, the more series I found on people's shelves. The subgenre doesn't matter here, because what matters is that there were too many books. And a lot of them had the same premise. Well, premises are another thing to uncover, I will do it later. In short, I did not know about a lot of fantasy books, now I keep seeing them all the time. You might think that it's a good thing because we have a lot of choice, and yeah, I agree with this. However, I am selective and only certain books capture my eye, and seeing too much is kinda overwhelming as well. Alright, let's move on. Well, second reason why I do not want to read fantasy anymore is that there are too many series. One of my favorite books is The Never-Ending Story by Michael Ende, and it's a standalone. And I also wrote a fantasy book that is a standalone as well, and I do not plan to write a sequel, a prequel, or whatever. It's just one book, and I'm not planning to write more. I'd rather invest my time and creativity into writing a new original novel, which I'm doing at the time of filming this video. So today is August 2nd, 2025. Have you noticed that a lot of fantasy books that you come across are a part of the series? Too many series. Do not get me wrong, I love good series, and back in the day, around the end of the 2000s and the early 2010s, I longed for more series. But just like this series, I also love standalones, and standalones, in my experience, unfortunately, are few and far between. Or at least I have yet to find them. I'd say that one solid standalone book is worth a lot more for me than a series of 15-something books. Everything is a series these days, and it's, kinda exhausting. Although, to be fair, this doesn't stop me from giving at least the first book in the series a chance if I find it interesting. Well, for example, I recently bought Malice by John Gwynne, the first book in the Faithful and the Fallen series. I know that there are 4 books, and I decided to read only the first one so far, but I'm sure that I'm gonna like it, and probably I would want to read more. Sure, some books make you think, author, sit down and write the next book. I'm looking at the direction of 2 certain writers who haven't released a full novel since 2011. You know who I'm talking about. And I do understand that in some cases authors are full of ideas for series and they simply have something to write about, and I appreciate that. And when the authors have ideas for series and they have something to write about, they usually write very well. And I also know that some authors write because the series pays off. But chasing the series can, like I said, can be exhausting, and what's worse, it makes people forget how amazing standalones can be. Oh yeah, I see the huge irony. In the past I longed for more series, and now I'm kinda done with them. Not entirely, because if I find a good series I'm willing to read it, but still. Alright, now we have the reason number 3. A lot of fantasy books in the premise have become predictable. Sometimes even the cover is predictable. I mean that you see a certain cover of a certain book and you know what it's about. Yeah, that's the problem. My focus in this video is going to be mostly epic fantasy because that's my cup of tea. My biggest issues in fantasy is that the same stories are repeated over and over again. It basically copy and paste, and that's kinda annoying. There is war between Kingdom 1 and Kingdom 2. There is this hero and there is this quest, and given that these days fantasy has to be realistic, there has to be a lot of dirt, both in terms of the setting and character morals. This is what makes me sad, to be honest. Fantasy is the most experimental genre of all. It's a genre where you can explore concepts, and even if you go back to a certain concept, you can explore it from a different perspective. You can do so much in fantasy. Why does it have to be always about war and political intrigue, especially in the modern days? Why does the main character has to be morally grey or whatever? Why does the setting has to be stuck in medieval times? And even if your book has all of these elements, why can't these elements explored from a different perspective? I'd like to remind you that one of the reasons A Song of Ice and Fire became so popular in the first place is because George R.R. Martin offered his readers a new perspective on these things. He took existing concepts in fantasy and he built something new. He explored them from a different perspective. Well, for example, a noble hero is crushed. Prince is a massive jerk. Well, if you know, you know. And it is important to point out that grey morality is not my thing anymore. I need to make one bookish confession here. I am glad that I read The Dark Tower, The Witcher, and The First Law when I did. I'm glad that I read them at that time, because I wouldn't pick these books up today. I picked these books up partially because at the time Game of Thrones was still airing, and I believed that good fantasy had to be brutal, down to earth, and the characters had to be morally grey. Ha 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 ha. No. I love positive characters. I love the characters that decide to stay good despite all the hardships. I really do not understand how people think that good characters are boring. I disagree on that. It's not that the positive characters have to be naive goody-goodies, but even then it's possible to come up with a good story for such characters and to explore the concept of the naive goody-goody. But in general, I love positive characters. I think of Luke Skywalker and Han Solo. Sure, Han Solo isn't the villain, but he's more of a bad boy type or something. And I think of Han and Luke, and I prefer Luke. Sure, it's not fantasy I'm talking about here, but you got the point. You have this more idealistic good boy like Luke, and you have a more rebellious Han Solo, and I think Luke is amazing. To be honest, him being a positive character is a part of his charm. And also here's one factor I hate about modern fantasy. Well, mostly it's modern, because back in the day that wasn't entirely the case. I hate the fact that I kinda blame George R. R. Martin for this, partially, a little bit, but still. I hate the fact that writers, they copy-paste the darkest and the most brutal aspects of history, particularly the medieval history, and they call it realistic. Spoiler, brutality doesn't count as realistic. Such view on history is shallow, and it doesn't represent the versatility of real-life history. Yes, it might be a shocking information to some people, but history does not only consist of battles and the wars and the suffering and you name it. There's more to history than that, and I can definitely tell you because I have a degree in international relations, and I had this subject called the history of diplomacy, and gonna tell you that a lot of history also included lots of pacts, treaties, and diplomatic relations. And even without that, there's more to history. There's also culture, there's also society, there's also everything else. What if I told you that as a writer you do not need to copy-paste the whole real-life history? And even if you decide to do that, what if I told you that history is much more versatile than you think? What if there is more than brutality or even a certain place? Because there are more places and time periods you could explore than just the ones that are flown in the mainstream. And what if I told you that above all, that despite you taking inspiration from history, you are not writing a historical fiction or historical documentary, you are writing fantasy. Fantasy is such a free space. At the end of the day, historical accuracy doesn't really matter. Reality in fantasy, the reality you write in fantasy can be whatever you want. You could look at certain things and then you can think, what if? That's the best part about fantasy, is that there are a lot of what ifs. Yeah, the premises have become predictable. And it's kinda sad that authors also think that the characters have to be even darker than Roland Descain from The Dark Tower and Geralt of Rivia, The Witcher. This kinda makes me appreciate Bilbo Baggins even more. I'd rather read The Hobbit again. I do not want to read fantasy books about those heroes who fight everything to see, sleep around, and are all dark and mysterious, and where supporting characters are decorative and they have no character. I do not want to read about dark and brutal settings where everybody is an asshole. It has become boring, predictable, and really unpleasant for me. Maybe in the Game of Thrones era I would have read such books more, but now, no. And the phrase "it's realistic" doesn't work if your world is too dark. Well, unless the whole premise of the book is that the world is dark and it's bad. Here's another shocking revelation to you. Dark and brutal things are also unrealistic. It's the same as idealistic side of things, but the other way around. And so we are coming to the end of this video, and keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that I haven't mentioned book talk and booktube fantasy books, because these books, they haven't been my vibe in the first place, so to hell with them. They do not matter in this discussion, especially given that lots of YouTubers have covered the topic of book talk and booktube fantasy. To a lot of writers, I do recommend reading Lord of the Rings again, or more Tolkien, because on my fourth read, I'm currently reading Return of the King, and I noticed that how versatile Lord of the Rings books really are, because they are epic, they're dark, they're sad, they're happy, they're comforting, they're whimsical. They have different vibes, and the vibes are really cool. It's still so weird to say that I do not want to read fantasy anymore. What's next? I do not want to listen to metal anymore. But that's not going to happen, because I have a lot of my favorite metal songs on repeat, and I keep discovering more. Anyway, that's all. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. See you next time. Goodbye.